Welcome, the Lord's chosen. The moment you connect the dots, the noise stops making sense, and the people who depended on that noise start sweating. There's a strange, almost cinematic pause that happens when clarity arrives. Not the loud kind, the quiet, unsettling kind. The kind where everything you've watched, tolerated, and mentally archived suddenly locks into place like a finished puzzle. No fireworks, no dramatic music, just a clean, undeniable realization. Oh, that's what this has been about the whole time. Here's a fact most people don't like to hear. The human brain is wired to avoid pattern completion when the result threatens identity. Neuroscience shows that when a realization challenges someone's self-image or social advantage, the brain experiences it as stress, not insight. In simple terms, connecting the dots doesn't feel enlightening to everyone. To some, it feels like being caught without ever being accused. That's why clarity often lands like a jump scare. This is where things get uncomfortable and unintentionally funny. Because while you're calmly rearranging information in your head like a responsible adult organizing files, someone else is internally panicking like, wait, when did you figure this out? You didn't announce it. You didn't posture. You didn't even change your tone. You just stopped being confused. And apparently that's enough to ruin the vibe. What most people don't realize is that confusion is a form of social permission. As long as you're unsure, people feel safe explaining, reframing, and slightly editing reality in their favor. The second you stop needing those explanations, the balance shifts. Suddenly you're not reacting, you're recognizing. And recognition is dangerous not because it's aggressive, but because it's irreversible. This isn't about being smarter, superior, or mysterious. It's about integration, about seeing how behavior repeats, how motives hide behind politeness, how outcomes expose intentions. When those dots connect, conversations change, energy changes. People start overperforming or under-explaining, not because you said something wrong, but because you're no longer lost in the fog with them. And that's the real reason for the oh shit moment. Not drama, not dominance. Just the silent realization that you're standing in the room with a person who finally understands what's been going on and doesn't need a meeting, a memo, or a motivational quote to prove it. Welcome to what happens after the dots connect. Number one, you didn't become smarter. You became integrated. There's a big difference between knowing more and understanding better. And most people never cross that line. They stack information, repeat clever phrases, quote ideas they barely live by, and mistake that for growth. What happened to you is different. You didn't just add new thoughts to your head. You connected the ones you already had. Experiences, mistakes, patterns, people, outcomes. They stopped living in separate boxes. They merged into one clear internal system. That's why things feel calmer now. Not easier, but calmer. You're no longer impressed by surface intelligence or shaken by emotional noise. You can tell when something doesn't add up without needing proof on the spot. You don't rush to react because your mind already ran the pattern quietly and reached a conclusion before your mouth ever got involved. This kind of integration changes how you move. You stop explaining yourself too much. You stop arguing for the sake of winning. You stop being pulled into confusion that isn't yours. Not because you're smarter than everyone else, but because you finally see how things connect beneath the surface. Once that happens, chaos loses its grip. People notice this shift even if they can't name it. Conversations with you feel different. You don't bite on bait. You don't fall for dramatic framing. You don't get lost in details that don't matter. That unsettles people who are used to controlling situations through complexity or emotion. They sense that you're no longer operating moment to moment. You're operating from understanding. Integration also brings restraint. You don't feel the urge to correct everyone or prove what you know. You understand timing. You understand cost. You understand that not every truth needs a microphone. That maturity reads as confidence, even when you say very little. This is the quiet turning point most people never reach, not because it's impossible, but because it requires sitting with uncomfortable realizations and letting old beliefs collapse. It requires admitting that some things you defended didn't deserve defending, and some people you trusted were predictable in ways you didn't want to see. Once everything connects, you can't unsee it. You don't feel superior. You feel grounded. And that grounding is exactly what makes others uneasy, because they're still juggling pieces while you're already looking at the whole picture. Number 2, they're realizing you understand cause, not just behavior. Most people stop at what they can see. They notice actions, words, reactions, moods. Someone lashes out, someone disappears, someone overpromises and underdelivers. That's where the conversation usually ends. You move past that. You started asking what keeps producing the same outcomes, even when the faces and situations change. You notice that behavior is often just the symptom, not the disease. This shift changes everything. When you understand cause, excuses lose their power. You don't get hypnotized by apologies that show up without change. You don't get confused when someone blames timing, stress, or bad luck for patterns that have been repeating for years. You recognize when someone's environment rewards bad habits, or when their identity depends on staying stuck. You're not being harsh, you're being accurate. People feel this accuracy right away. They sense that you're no longer reacting to what just happened. You're responding to what always happens. That's deeply unsettling. It means their usual tricks don't work. The story sounds familiar to you because you've already seen the ending play out before. Understanding cause also makes you harder to manipulate. Emotional displays don't distract you. Technical explanations don't overwhelm you. You can tell when someone is busy explaining what they did to avoid talking about why they did it. That awareness creates a quiet power shift. You're no longer negotiating with appearances. What really rattles people is that you don't need to confront them. You don't corner them with logic or call them out dramatically. You simply adjust your expectations and your boundaries. You stop offering the same chances. You stop being surprised. That silent recalibration is louder than any argument. This kind of understanding doesn't come from reading a few smart ideas. It comes from watching outcomes honestly, including your own. It comes from admitting when you were fooled, when you ignored red flags, when you wanted a different story to be true. That honesty sharpens your perception. Once you see causes clearly, you stop taking things personally. You realize that most behavior has very little to do with you. It's about incentives, fears, habits, and unresolved conflicts people carry everywhere they go. That realization brings clarity, not bitterness. And that's when the oh shit moment hits for others. They sense you're no longer dealing with symptoms. You're dealing with roots, and roots don't lie. Number 3, you stopped arguing and started mapping. Most people live in a world where arguments feel like the currency of intelligence. The louder, faster, or more aggressive you are, the more weight they assume your mind carries. You, however, stopped playing that game. You realized arguments rarely reveal truth. They reveal ego, insecurity, and performance. What you started doing instead was mapping, quietly observing, connecting, and predicting. You watched patterns repeat, habits solidify, motives hide behind smiles, and contradictions spill out like invisible ink. Mapping doesn't need volume. It doesn't need emotional theatrics. It doesn't need you to declare that you see everything. Instead, it's subtle, relentless, and surgical. You're not reacting to each move as if it's new. You're seeing the trajectory before it happens. And when you finally speak, your words land not as debate, but as conclusion. That's when people feel the weight. They realize you've been reading the board, not just responding to the pieces. This kind of awareness makes arguments obsolete. You no longer waste energy trying to convince someone who is anchored in denial or pride. You focus on understanding connections, why certain behaviors emerge, which actions repeat, and how intentions disguise themselves in chaos. That shift is unnerving to others because it removes their usual leverage. They can't bait you. They can't trap you in their narrative. They can't gaslight you into believing a version of reality that only serves them. The power of mapping lies in patience. While everyone else is reacting to noise, you are observing the pattern that produces the noise. You know what triggers certain behaviors, what people are likely to overlook, and where the weak links in their reasoning lie. That silent knowledge gives you authority without a single boast. People notice this even when you don't make it obvious. Your calm, deliberate presence communicates that you're operating on a higher plane of awareness. And that's what triggers the "oh sht" moment. Not because you said something shocking, but because they realize all their strategies and performances are transparent to you. They see the map you've drawn in your mind, and they can't hide from it. Number 4, they sense you can predict them, and that terrifies people. Humans are wired to fear losing control, and nothing triggers that fear faster than realizing someone else can see the moves before they're even made. You didn't learn to predict people by guessing or by being manipulative. You learned to predict by noticing patterns, timing, habits, and incentives. You started recognizing the subtle ways people give themselves away long before they try to hide it. That kind of insight isn't flashy or loud, but it's unmistakable, and it makes others uneasy in ways they can't fully articulate. Prediction isn't about reading minds. It's about reading consistency and contradictions. You notice who reacts the same way under pressure, who lies for comfort, and who bends reality to fit their narrative. When you act from that knowledge, people realize their usual tactics no longer work. That realization hits like cold water. They can't bluff. They can't manipulate. They can't hide behind confusion. They're suddenly on display in front of someone who isn't impressed, who isn't shocked, and who isn't playing along. The scary part for them isn't that you're smarter, it's that you're unshakable. You respond in ways that make sense to the pattern you've observed, not to the chaos they try to create. And when they see that you consistently anticipate outcomes, the panic begins. They notice the gap between what they intended to do and what you already accounted for. That gap breeds fear because it strips away the illusion of control they've always relied on. What's most unnerving is that you rarely announce your awareness. You don't make threats. You don't gloat. You simply exist in alignment with what you know. And that silence, coupled with precise action, makes them realize they've been predictable all along. At some point, the weight of being understood before they even act becomes unbearable for them. Their mind races, trying to find a hidden move, a loophole, or a misstep that could put them back in control. But there isn't one. You've already connected the dots, anticipated the steps, and adjusted accordingly. And that's when their "oh sh" moment lands, not because of aggression, but because they realize that their behavior has been transparent the entire time, and you've been watching it unfold with clarity and calm precision. Number 5, you no longer need their version of events. Most people live tethered to narratives that aren't theirs. They rely on explanations, justifications, and stories from others to shape their reality, to feel safe, and to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. You stop doing that. You don't need someone else's version of what happened, why it happened, or how it should be interpreted. You've learned to observe, connect, and understand outcomes on your own terms. That freedom is subtle but profoundly unsettling for those around you. When you stop relying on someone's narrative, You stop being manipulated by spin, excuses, or carefully crafted impressions. Lies lose their power because they no longer require validation. The emotional weight people try to throw at you, guilt, outrage, fear, or charm, falls flat. You see the mechanics behind the stories, the incentives that shape them, the patterns that make them predictable. This isn't arrogance, it's clarity. And clarity has a way of making others squirm without you lifting a finger. People panic when they realize their explanations no longer matter. Every attempt to convince you, to persuade you, to justify themselves becomes transparent. They notice the gap between what they want you to believe and what you can see clearly. That gap creates tension because it's no longer a conversation of mutual understanding. It's a one-sided exposure. The subtle realization that you are untouchable by their narrative is frightening for anyone accustomed to influence through explanation. This freedom also changes your interactions. You don't argue over who's right. You don't defend your own perspective endlessly. You observe, connect, and respond based on evidence and consistency. Your actions reflect understanding, not performance. That makes others feel exposed because they are still operating in a world of appearances, trying to control perception instead of reality. Once you stop needing their version of events, you hold the power of authenticity silently. Others feel it. They realize you aren't trapped in the games they play, and that quiet detachment, that independence from their story, sparks a profound "Osht" moment. They can see it. They know it. And there's nothing they can do to put the mask back on. Number 6, you recognized incentives hide inside personalities. Most people think character is something fixed, something you can judge at a glance. What you realized is far more revealing. Behavior is rarely about who someone claims to be. It's about what they gain from being that way. Incentives hide in plain sight, embedded in choices, habits, and relationships. Once you start noticing them, you stop being fooled by appearances, charm, or moral posturing. That shift changes everything, and it makes others uneasy in ways they can't quite put into words. When you see the incentives behind behavior, everything becomes a little too transparent. People realize their tactics, excuses, and performances no longer work on you because you're not evaluating them by the mask they wear. You're reading the strategy beneath it. A smile isn't just a smile, it's a calculated signal. A compliment isn't just kindness, it's a potential gain. Decisions that seemed random suddenly line up as predictable patterns of self-interest. That level of insight is subtle but seismic, because most people rely on surface judgments to navigate the world. This understanding also frees you from wasted energy. You stop trying to convince people to act differently or hoping they'll reveal a better side. You focus on the incentives they respond to, the structures they operate within, and the predictable consequences of their choices. That's when influence stops being about persuasion and starts being about alignment. You adjust your own behavior to navigate reality, not to bend it to fantasy. Others notice this quiet shift. They see that their strategies, manipulations, or performances are no longer effective. They sense that you're no longer impressed, surprised, or caught off guard. That realization hits hard because it exposes a gap they didn't expect, the gap between who they want to appear as and who they are in your perception. Recognizing incentives in personalities is more than just awareness. It's a lens that transforms social dynamics. People can feel it without being able to articulate it. That silent clarity, that ability to see the motives hiding in plain sight, sparks the unmistakable "Osht" moment. They know you see the game, the rules, and the moves, and nothing they do can hide the truth from you. Number 7, they feel seen, not understood. And that's worse. There's a subtle difference between being understood and being seen, and most people confuse the two. Being understood feels comforting. It means someone has stepped into your world, aligned with your perspective, and empathized with your struggles. Being seen, on the other hand, strips away the comfort. It's a quiet, unshakable awareness of exactly who you are. Not the version you present, not the story you tell yourself, but the sum of patterns, contradictions, and truths you try to hide. When you see people this way, it's not judgment. You're not there to punish, lecture, or advise. You simply notice. You register. Every inconsistency, every repeated excuse, every hidden motive becomes visible to you without you saying a word. And that visibility is terrifying for them, because it leaves no room for performance. Masks, charm, excuses, and manipulations. All of it becomes irrelevant the moment they realize someone is looking past it. People panic, not because you're aggressive, but because your awareness doesn't need justification. They can't bargain with it, argue against it, or charm it away. It exists independently of their approval or denial. That is what creates the intense oh-shti energy. They recognize, often subconsciously, that their usual methods of managing perception, lying, exaggerating, minimizing, have no effect on you. You are outside the theater of their creation, and that alone is unsettling. This ability also changes your own behavior. You stop being distracted by noise, petty drama, or superficial charm. You stop overreacting to what isn't relevant. Your responses become precise, measured, and effective because they originate from a complete picture rather than a partial understanding. That quiet confidence is visible, even when you say very little. And that is why being seen, rather than merely understood, shakes people at a core level. It is the moment they sense transparency where they expected fog. They feel exposed without being accused. They realize they can't control the narrative or hide the truth. Your clarity becomes a mirror they didn't ask for. And once they see themselves through it, there's no going back. Number 8. You stopped reacting to tone and started listening to structure. Most people get trapped by tone. The anger, the charm, the urgency, the sarcasm, it hijacks their attention and drives their reactions. You didn't fall into that trap. You stopped responding to how things sounded and started paying attention to how things worked. Structure became your guide. Patterns, sequences, timing, and consistency replaced the noise of emotion. You noticed how arguments built, how behaviors repeated, how words masked intentions, and how outcomes followed predictable paths. Once you shifted focus from tone to structure, your world changed, and the people around you began noticing it in ways that quietly unsettled them. When you listen to structure instead of tone, manipulations lose their power. Someone can yell, plead, or charm, and it no longer pulls you off course. You're reading the blueprint, not the decoration. Every explanation, every story, every performance becomes a set of predictable moves rather than a persuasive force. And because most people live by appearances and theatrics, this awareness immediately puts you on a different plane. They sense that their usual levers, guilt, fear, flattery, dramatics, no longer work. That realization creates tension and subtle panic. This shift also sharpens your decisions. You're no longer reacting impulsively to chaos. You're responding to causality. You know which behaviors will lead to outcomes and which words are just empty gestures. That precision allows you to operate calmly, even in situations where everyone else is losing control. People notice that calm, they feel it. And because it's coupled with insight, they can't fake their way back into influence over you. The beauty of focusing on structure is that it gives you foresight. You can anticipate the patterns that others are too distracted by tone to see. That anticipation isn't about manipulation. It's about clarity. It's about being aligned with reality rather than performance. And when others realize that their tone no longer moves you, that their theatrics are transparent, that their patterns are predictable. They experience that unmistakable oh-sh-t moment. They realize they've been operating in a world of illusions while you have been quietly seeing the architecture behind it all. Number 9, they realize you're no longer confused by complexity. Complexity terrifies most people because it feels endless, messy, and unmanageable. They get lost in details, contradictions, and exceptions, spinning in circles and hoping someone else will provide clarity. You didn't just survive complexity. You learned to decode it. You stopped being overwhelmed by layers of behavior, hidden motives, conflicting interests, and tangled outcomes. Instead, you learned to see the underlying structure that makes the chaos predictable. That shift is subtle, but for others it's disorienting and in many cases terrifying. When you understand complexity, nothing surprises you unnecessarily. You notice patterns and repetitions, hidden incentives, and predictable consequences. You can trace a decision from start to finish, see where pressure will crack someone's performance, and anticipate outcomes before they unfold. People around you start realizing that the stories, excuses, and chaos they rely on to feel in control no longer affect you. They sense that you see the full picture while they're still fumbling with fragments. That realization sparks discomfort because it exposes how little control they actually have over situations you calmly navigate. Being comfortable in complexity also changes how you respond. You don't panic, overreact, or waste energy on drama. You observe, analyze, and act in alignment with what the situation truly requires, not what the noise demands. That quiet precision is unnerving to others because it makes their usual theatrics, manipulations, and frantic energy irrelevant. They start realizing that no matter how complicated they try to make the situation, you've already understood it, broken it down, and located the weak points and predictable outcomes. This understanding doesn't make you superior. It makes you unshakable. While others are exhausted by contradictions and conflicts, you remain centered. That calm clarity triggers the oh shit moment in them. They realize that the complexity they thought was intimidating no longer intimidates you. They see that you're operating from comprehension rather than confusion, and that awareness, silent, measured, and unwavering, makes you impossible to rattle, control, or manipulate. It's not aggression, it's understanding, and understanding terrifies those who have spent their lives relying on confusion to protect themselves. Number 10, you don't need to expose people. They expose themselves around you. There's a strange power in simply being present and aware. Most people spend their energy trying to control how others perceive them, carefully curating words, gestures, and stories to hide flaws or manipulate impressions. You, however, stopped needing to force truth or confront deception. You became someone whose awareness naturally highlights inconsistencies and contradictions. Around you, the act of being oneself, with all its slips, shortcuts, and masks, becomes impossible to fake. People reveal themselves without realizing it, and that revelation is far more powerful than anything you could point out. When someone exposes themselves in your presence, it isn't loud or dramatic, it's subtle. A misstep in a story, an over-explained detail, a pause too long, a glance that betrays discomfort. These small signals, which most people ignore or dismiss, are obvious to you. You've learned to read context, timing, and patterns so that the truths people try to hide stand out like bright markers. You don't call attention to them. You simply adjust your understanding and respond appropriately. That invisible control is disarming because the exposure comes from their own behavior, not your intervention. This creates an unspoken tension. People start second-guessing themselves, overperforming or under-explaining in your presence. They realize that the usual tactics that work on others, charm, lies, urgency, or deception, fail with you. That realization is subtle but profound. They understand that they can't hide from your perception, and that awareness alone shifts the dynamic. The beauty of this is that it's effortless. You don't need confrontation, argument, or correction. Your clarity and observation do the work, and people self-reveal without you having to provoke them. It's quiet, almost invisible, but the psychological impact is undeniable. That's why this moment, the Osht moment, lands so hard. People feel exposed, not because of anything you said, but because they can't stop showing the truth themselves. Around you, honesty surfaces uninvited, and that realization that they can no longer control what you see is both humbling and terrifying. Number 11. They understand you're immune to their urgency. Urgency is one of the oldest tools people use to manipulate attention and action. Most of the time it works because people panic when someone else declares a problem or demands immediate response. They rely on the idea that quick reactions mean compliance, that fast agreement masks understanding, and that speed can substitute for clarity. You broke that pattern. You stopped reacting to the rush and started observing the structure behind it. You learned to see when urgency is real, when it's manufactured, and when it's meant to trigger confusion or guilt. That shift doesn't just make you calm. It makes you untouchable in ways people can't quite digest. When someone realizes their pressure tactics fail on you, the effect is immediate. They notice that yelling, deadlines, or dramatic gestures don't shake your focus. They see that you respond according to understanding and priority, not panic. The energy they were counting on to control the narrative or accelerate their advantage collapses in silence. They begin to overcompensate, over-explain, or even falter, trying to regain the control they assumed they had. And all of this happens without you needing to act aggressively, argue, or even raise your voice. Being immune to urgency isn't about indifference. It's about clarity and foresight. You've trained yourself to prioritize patterns over panic, causes over theatrics, and outcomes over appearances. That patience doesn't make you passive. It makes your moves precise and deliberate. Every response carries weight because it isn't reactionary. It's calculated from understanding. That calm decisiveness is disorienting to others because it exposes the gap between their frantic attempts to push and your composed evaluation of what matters. What terrifies people is how effortless it looks. They expect urgency to dominate attention, to bend decisions, to force reactions. When it doesn't, the oh shati moment hits. They realize they've lost leverage, not through confrontation, but because you refuse to participate in the chaos. Your immunity to urgency isn't loud, but it's absolute. And once they notice it, they can't return to the comfort of assuming control. Number 12. You stopped seeking validation and started seeking coherence. Most people spend their lives chasing approval, whether it's from friends, colleagues, or strangers online. They adjust their words, actions, and even thoughts to fit expectations, constantly asking themselves if they're liked, respected, or admired. You broke away from that. You realize that external validation is fleeting and unreliable, while coherence, the alignment of thought, action, and understanding, creates a foundation that cannot be shaken. You began measuring yourself against reality, patterns, and logic, rather than applause or recognition. That shift is quiet, but it carries an undeniable power that people around you sense immediately. When you stop chasing validation, your actions become rooted in consistency. You don't need to over-explain yourself, justify decisions, or perform for attention. Every choice comes from internal clarity rather than external pressure. That clarity radiates, and others notice it even if they can't name it. It unsettles them, because it exposes the fragility of their own dependence on approval. They see that their attempts to influence or impress you are irrelevant. You are no longer operating in a world where their judgment carries weight. This change also transforms your interactions. You respond based on what aligns with logic and understanding, not on what earns nods or smiles. You measure outcomes, track patterns, and act according to your own internal standards. That makes your decisions precise and unshakable, and it removes the emotional friction most people experience when trying to please others. People feel this shift in subtle ways. They realize that their usual social levers, flattery, persuasion, dramatics, no longer produce results. The silence, the calm, the consistency all point to a mind operating on coherence, not approval. That's when the oh-sh-t moment lands. They see that you are not swayed by perception or emotion, but by understanding, and that realization is disorienting. Seeking coherence over validation doesn't make you cold or disconnected. It makes you grounded, intentional, and untouchable by the noise of others. And once people notice that, they can't unsee it. They realize that nothing they say or do can alter the fact that your alignment is with truth and understanding, not fleeting social approval. Number 13. They sense you've outgrown their game, but not the board. Most people live in a world of games, subtle competitions, manipulations, and performances designed to assert control, test loyalty, or gain advantage. They assume that anyone who rises above the chaos has left the game entirely, disappeared into some untouchable zone. You didn't leave the game, you stayed on the board, but you stopped playing by their rules. You understood the mechanics, the patterns, the incentives, and the consequences, and you moved through the system with clarity rather than impulse. That difference is seismic, and it terrifies people because it's impossible to categorize or manipulate. When you operate like this, people notice immediately. They see that you are present, aware, and engaged, yet immune to their usual tactics. You are on the same field, but the way you navigate it renders their strategies irrelevant. They realize that their tricks, their pressure, their attempts to mislead or control all fail because you've outgrown the reactive, performance-driven mindset they rely on to feel safe. You're no longer responding to chaos. You're understanding it, anticipating it, and adjusting without drama. This doesn't make you superior in the loud, boastful sense. It makes you untouchable in a quiet, almost invisible way. Your actions carry weight because they are intentional, calculated, and aligned with understanding rather than ego. People begin to panic, not because you threaten them, but because they see their power slipping in subtle increments. Their perception of control evaporates, and they're left exposed in their own game, still scrambling to maintain an illusion that no longer exists. Being on the board but outgrowing the game also changes how you interact with others. You can participate, negotiate, and influence without being pulled into petty conflicts or shallow performances. That independence is disarming. People sense that you are untethered from the usual dynamics, and that awareness sparks the unmistakable oh-sh-t moment. They realize that while they are still caught in the rules, pressures, and manipulations of the system, you are moving freely within it, seeing clearly, and no longer subject to the same traps. That clarity is powerful, silent, and profoundly unsettling to anyone who counted on your predictability. Number 14. Their oh shit moment isn't about you. It's about themselves. Most people think the shock, the panic, or the discomfort they feel around someone who sees clearly is caused by that person. They assume it's about judgment, confrontation, or dominance. The truth is far more revealing. It's about themselves. The oh-sh-t moment doesn't hit because of your awareness, insight, or composure. It hits because they finally see the cracks they've been hiding from, the shortcuts, contradictions, and patterns they've relied on to navigate life. They realize that they've been predictable, exposed, or even complicit in their own confusion, and that realization lands harder than anything anyone else could say or do. When you connect the dots and operate from clarity, people start reflecting whether they mean to or not. They notice their repeated mistakes, their avoidance, the ways they bend truths or manipulate narratives, and the uncomfortable reality that much of their strategy, socially, professionally, emotionally, is transparent to you. They scramble to maintain appearances, but appearances only go so far. Your calm, deliberate awareness highlights gaps in their logic, gaps in their morality, gaps in the stories they've been telling themselves. That exposure isn't personal, but it feels intensely personal because it touches the parts they've been avoiding. This moment is silent but powerful. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to call them out. Simply existing with understanding, observing patterns, and responding with precision forces them to confront truths about themselves. They realize they can't manipulate, charm, or mislead you in the ways they've used on others. The panic isn't about your behavior, it's about the dissonance they feel when they see themselves clearly reflected in your perception. That realization is uncomfortable because it's unavoidable. They can't pretend, argue, or escape the clarity you bring. Your awareness doesn't attack, it illuminates, and illumination exposes what shadow and denial have kept hidden. That is the core of the "oh shit" moment. Not fear of you, but fear of what they finally understand about themselves, and the undeniable truth that you see it all without needing to comment. What ties all of this together is simple yet profound. Clarity changes everything. When you stop reacting to noise, stop chasing validation, and stop being fooled by appearances, you step into a space where patterns become obvious, behavior becomes predictable, and truth no longer needs to be spoken to be understood. People around you feel it. They sense the difference between those who act from confusion and those who operate from understanding. That silent awareness, that quiet alignment with reality, shifts dynamics without aggression, without drama, and without chaos. It's subtle, but it's undeniable, and that is why the "oh shit" moment hits so hard. Every step we explored, connecting the dots, recognizing incentives, seeing through performance, anticipating outcomes, refusing to be manipulated by urgency, and holding a mirror long enough for people to confront themselves, builds into one undeniable truth. Mastery isn't about dominance. It's about comprehension. It's about moving through life with precision, patience, and understanding, while others scramble to keep up. That's the kind of presence that commands respect without demanding it, that disarms manipulation without conflict, and that creates the kind of psychological weight people feel even when you say nothing. The real takeaway is that power, influence, and respect aren't shouted or forced. They are earned silently, one observation, one connection, and one calm decision at a time. When you operate from that space, everything changes. Your perspective, your relationships, and how the world reacts to you. People notice, whether they admit it or not, and once they do, the shift is permanent. If this breakdown resonated with you and you want more insights like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. Hit the like button if it gave you an aha moment. Share it with someone who needs to see it, and drop a comment below with your thoughts or experiences. Your engagement helps us keep uncovering the truths most people don't see. And trust me, the next one will be even deeper. Stay blessed always.